Okay, everyone. So the brand new Boruto to Blue Vortex chapter has officially been released. This is chapter 26, and we are going to go through this chapter right here. I'm going to give you my thoughts. And before we do, guys, as always, I do have to just get the YouTube stuff out of the way. If you enjoy what I do here, remember to leave a like, share the video, subscribe if you are new, and please, guys, comment down below with whatever your thoughts are. Those things all really help push videos out into the algorithm. So with that stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get into this chapter. And there's definitely some stuff that we do need to talk about. So right at the beginning of the chapter, we have the teaser, the first teaser that was released, where we see Inojin visiting Himawari and he's giving her that jar of honey. And then when he leaves, he comes into contact with one of Kashin Koji's frogs. And this is where he is hearing him speak to him. And we originally think that this is Kashin Koji, but as we find out later on, it's actually not Koji. It's actually Boruto. So the frog, or Inojin, hears through the frog the question of whether or not he has essentially feelings for Himawari, and he essentially confirms. And then later he, gets asked, do you want to protect her? And that's when he basically gives him the offer that, hey, if you want to keep her safe, then you need to come with me. And that's when we see Inojin at the hideout with Koji, with Boruto. And this is where Koji is telling him who he is, that he is someone who is fighting against the awakened Shinjuu. And then he hears Boruto speak to him. And basically Boruto is warning him that basically if Inojin has any plans of escaping, he can't because, Inojin doesn't really know where he is. But he is telling him that, once they're done, once their essentially business is done and, over with, then Boruto will, take him back home. And this is where, or actually, sorry, before we get to the next part, let me just talk about this. So this is very interesting because number one, since Inojin is essentially being connected to Himawari, it does make sense that he would essentially be given a bit of a bigger role than he has had up until this point in the story. Because up until this point, he was really just a side character. He was a guy who was kind of just there. I mean, obviously the anime does go, more into his character, but this is the manga, it's not the anime. And, the manga only has a limited amount of time. So obviously it needs to focus on the things it needs to, specifically anything that's important to actually move the story forward. But now it's actually giving him a bigger role, which I do like because, again, if you are going to connect him to Himawari, and Himawari seems like she is going to have a bigger role in the story, then it only makes sense for Inojin to actually be involved in, that story as well. So those are my thoughts on that, about him being essentially given a bigger role into the story than what we've seen him have, up until this point. And so once that's done, we cut back to the Shinjuu dimension, and this is where we see something very interesting. So we see Hidari, and he's reading a book, like what we saw the last time from him. And this is very interesting because we see Hidari is slowly mimicking Jura. So Hidari, up until this point, from what we've seen, has shown no interest in things like reading books and, actually learning things. And basically everything that he's learned from Jura. So we know, for example, that Hidari knows about the Sharingan because that's what Jura told him. Jura was the one who informed him about that. But now we're seeing Hidari is actually learning things for himself. And throughout this chapter, throughout this exchange, this section of the story, we keep seeing him paying close attention to Jura. And again, I'm wondering how exactly, or where exactly is the story going to go? Like, what exactly is the story planning here? I know there are theories about Hidari that he might betray the Shinjuu. We'll see if that does end up happening. I don't know, but it is definitely a possibility because we keep seeing the story constantly show us Hidari taking an interest in Jura. And it's definitely more than what we've seen from the other awakened Shinjuu. And the thing is, it's not just Jura. Even with the other awakened Shinjuu, we see Hidari paying close attention to them anytime something happens with them in the awakened Shinjuu dimension. So we see Jura and he's crying, and Hidari points it out, and then Jura tells him that it's because he's reading this novel, and he points out that even though it's fictional, it still affected him. And Hidari points out how he went through something similar a while ago, and that's where he points out that what he was feeling wasn't his own emotions, it was Matsuri's emotions. and he talks about how she even got those emotions and what they even were. It was anger, sadness, and he even, according to him, catches a glimpse of the feeling of love, which is obviously something Jura is, very interested in. And again, this is where we see another panel of Hidari paying close attention to Jura. So again, this is definitely something that we should absolutely keep our eye on, because again, something is definitely being planned with him. We're seeing way too many of these panels of Hidari paying close attention to the other awakened Shinjuu for essentially nothing to come of it. Or I'm going to be really surprised if nothing happens, because of it, or if nothing happens with him as a result of all this setup. I'm going to be, a little bit shocked if nothing happens. And this is where we get kind of a funny comment from Jura, where he asks Hidari whether he finds that, disgusting, because in the previous chapter, or not the previous chapter, the one before that, in chapter 24, when Jura told Hidari about how happy he was that, Kawaki complimented him and everything that he was feeling, Hidari just said he thought that it was disgusting. So a bit of a callback to that moment. And here we actually get the opposite answer from Hidari, where he says, no, it's actually interesting that Jura is experiencing all these emotions. Again, something is definitely being set up with them. So I'm really, really curious to see where they take the story. But then Jura basically tells him that even with all of this, it's still not really enough to understand or even keep control of essentially their own emotions, and how they still need more information. And this is where we see Mamushi come into the conversation. So Mamushi essentially tells them that he thinks he understands why he chose Ada as his target, or why his instincts were telling him to pick Ada as his target. And Jura, of course, is interested, and he asks him to explain. And he tells her that he doesn't want to devour her just because, just for the sake of it. He says he wants control. And he basically says he wants to take her genetic information and make it his. Now, I've seen people point out that this is kind of this kind of has a double meaning. And considering this is a Naruto series, it honestly would not surprise me if that was indeed the case. I mean, if you go back to, the Naruto manga and you read it, you'll see that there are a lot of moments where there's essentially like things that characters are saying where you can take it a completely different direction. And Kishimoto is kind of known for including that in his writing. And once again, we get another panel of Hidari paying close attention to this, panel that's focusing on Mamushi, where he's essentially explaining his goal. So again, just something to keep in mind. And this is where we hear Mamushi basically say that he doesn't really care about, love and all that stuff. All he cares about is essentially that they, as a species, the awakened Shinjuu, need to survive, essentially more than anything. And this is where we hear Jura's comment about how basically, like, maybe it's actually not a bad thing to learn about love. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because up until this point, Jura wanted to essentially know about love, not just because he found it interesting, but also because he knew that understanding it and controlling it would be key to them surviving as a species. And he was in a way kind of afraid of it because he knew it was something that could affect them. But now he's completely essentially changed it to where now he actually wants to know more, but he's essentially diving deep into his essentially desire to understand about love, or essentially not a bad way to understand Mamushi's vision of love or how he sees it. So when we're done with that, we cut back to the village, and here we cut back to Shikamaru, and here we see him being made contact with Koji through Inojin's use of the mind transmission jutsu. And Koji does tell him that he has Inojin's help. And it's interesting because we see a panel of Inojin looking at Koji, and he seems worried because essentially Koji basically just told Shikamaru that Inojin is breaking a lot of their rules, which obviously is not going to be a good thing, because if it ever does get found out, then he's going to be in pretty big trouble. But this is where Koji is telling him that essentially he is going to be in his ear, and he's going to give him as much advice about what's going to happen to him, because he knows that Shikamaru is about to meet with the elders, and thanks to omnipotence, or not omnipotence, thanks to the 10 directions, he basically knows all the different ways this conversation is going to go, at least now, barring, of course, any interference that causes another update. So basically, he's telling him, look, I'm going to be in your ear and I'm going to guide you. I'm going to tell you what to say. I'm going to tell you what to do, everything in order to make sure they don't throw you out as Hokage. And this is where we see Shikamaru enter into the room with the elders, but he also sees the aide to the daimyo. And this is where basically they're asking him questions about, the intel that he's using for these missions and basically what happened in the sand. And essentially Shikamaru is he's doing exactly what Koji is essentially telling him, where he's being very careful, and he's doing with the elders what he did with Konohamaru before they went on the mission to the sand, where he's basically telling them that, look, I have information. It's not really reliable, but I chose to trust my instincts and follow this intel. And, clearly it did work out well. And this is where they ask him, where exactly did you get the intel? And he tells them, I can't reveal that. And of course, they're not just going to, accept that. And this is where they ask him, whether or not the source of the information is Boruto. And Shikamaru doesn't really answer, which I think was kind of a mistake on his part, because by not answering, he kind of essentially gave it away. And this is where the one of the elders reveals that essentially there are rumors floating around the village that the leaders, or that some people are working with Boruto. And obviously that's unacceptable to them, because in their eyes, Boruto is a traitor, he's a criminal. So obviously anyone working with him would also be considered a traitor and a criminal to the village. And this is where we see Konohamaru step in to stand up for Shikamaru. And Shikamaru tries to stop him, but Koji tells him to let him speak and essentially have them put their focus on him. So yeah, you can see Koji doesn't really, essentially he doesn't care once again about any casualties if it means they accomplish their goals, or at least he's okay. From what I'm seeing, he's okay with minimal casualties if it means accomplishing their goals of making sure that there aren't mass casualties. You know what I mean? And it's something that he does bring up even in this chapter, but we already know this just by, hearing him talk in the previous chapters about, how he saw, what was her name? Yodo's death as acceptable because it led to something important happening, which is Sarada awakening her Mangekyo, which also comes into play later on in the story, but we'll get to that. And we see Konohamaru trying to, in a way, defend Boruto by saying how Boruto saved his life and how without his help we wouldn't have succeeded in this mission. And, technically he's not wrong. And how he at least believes that Boruto doesn't have any intention of actually hurting Konoha. And he says that, look, at the very least, let's hear him out. Let's not just completely push him aside and only, just see him as a criminal. And this is where one of the elders, again, just brings up a pretty good point, at least from their perspective, is that, Boruto, who, again, originally it's Kawaki, but because of omnipotence, they think is Boruto. He is essentially someone who tried to take down the Hokage. And without question, he is still a criminal. Now, the thing about it is, while a lot of people may see this as being unfair, you also have to remember that technically they are not wrong. Kawaki did attack Naruto. He sealed him away. He removed him from the village, basically leaving the village vulnerable. Someone as powerful as Naruto removed from the village. And even though you had characters there or people there that were powerful, you still had someone who added to the defense of the village. And when you remove that, you've essentially weakened the village. So in their eyes, yes, Boruto is essentially someone who is a criminal. He did something that deserves to be punished. So again, you can at least sort of see it from their perspective, even though, again, we have the information they don't, which again adds a little bit of dramatic irony to this, because you're seeing them doing all these things, even though that they are not aware of a lot of things that we as readers are aware of. You know what I mean? And we see Konohamaru trying to once again, defend Boruto, but this is where Shikamaru stops him. And the aide to the daimyo points out that even though, okay, yes, the mission to the village has been a success, at the same time, it doesn't change the fact that we have people who are working with Boruto. And that's essentially not a good thing, because it basically says that the security of the village is essentially compromised. So his job essentially is to try and find out who the co-conspirators essentially are. And it's interesting because when we see him say that he is going to expose the co-conspirators, Boruto's co-conspirators, it cuts to a panel of Konohamaru, Sai, and Shikamaru. And this is very interesting because it tells you that they are definitely going to essentially be a part of this whole story, this sort of political maneuvering that we're seeing right now. And then we cut back to the hideout with Koji, Boruto, and Inojin. And Inojin is expressing how worried he is about all these rules that they're breaking and wondering how they essentially operate like this. And this is where Koji reveals a good point where, look, right now, we've got the entire world against us. We don't really have a choice but to break the rules or to be clever, essentially. And we see an interesting moment from him where he basically reminds Inojin that he is essentially a part of this with us. Now, to me, why this is interesting, because Koji, you could see this as a way of him essentially manipulating Inojin, telling him, listen, you have to remember, you are here with us and you're also breaking the rules. So if something happens to us, something is going to happen to you, in a way sort of trying to essentially make him feel guilty and trying to remind him in a way not to have any like sudden attacks of conscience and basically like not break the rules. Now, granted, Inojin, I think, knows what he's doing, but he's okay with it because he knows that it's going to lead to Himawari being safe. And this is where Boruto reminds him that the enemies that they're dealing with are not people who are playing by rules. They're not people who are playing by the same morals that we have. And so essentially, we don't really have a choice but to essentially play the rules by their games and not play by our rules, the ones that we know. And he tells Inojin that he needs to start thinking with his head and not his emotions. And this is where Inojin responds, where he says, look, I went up against him and I know how strong this guy is. I know that you need to essentially be willing to, cross certain lines essentially in order to be able to take this guy down. And then we get a moment from Koji where he asks Boruto about the deal that he made with Momoshiki. And this is interesting because Koji now knows, due to how Boruto got Kawaki involved, that Boruto is not afraid to go behind Koji's back and make plans without him. And in a way, Koji is essentially letting Boruto know that he is aware of what he's doing. Basically, in a way, he's telling him, I know that you are finding ways to go behind my back, and I know that you're doing this. And Boruto just brushes it off aside, and he says to him, listen, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. And Koji tells him that's not really an answer and how he isn't really a fan of Boruto's attitude. And this is where Boruto essentially, throws it back at him, where he's telling him like, okay, listen, you're not really one to talk because you have a habit of, leaving specific information out. And then he asks him basically, how many were originally supposed to die during the sand mission had I not gotten involved, essentially. And this is where Koji tells him that, look, I just guided things essentially to the proper path so that Sarada can awaken her Mangekyo. That way we can avoid a future where there are even more people killed. And then he basically, in a way insults Boruto by telling him, okay, look, if you've got any more childish criticism, then you know what? Just let me hear about it now. And Boruto just essentially shuts it down and says, you know what? Forget it. Let's just move on. And he immediately contacts Shikamaru again. And Shikamaru lets him know that the interrogations have begun and that his turn will eventually, come soon. But he is free now. And Koji tells him to contact him should anything change. And this is where he tells him that about 1 week from today, Mamushi is going to show up in Konoha and he's going to essentially tell him about Mamushi's abilities and how you can deal with him. Now, this is interesting. So here are my thoughts on this. So for me, one thing that I haven't really liked about, Koji and, 10 Directions is that he, in a way, has kind of made things easy for our main characters. You know what I mean? Like, it feels like we're losing out on those moments of characters, going up against antagonists and not really knowing what they're dealing with, and sort of, figuring out through fighting them about, okay, who are they? What are their abilities? What are their weaknesses? You know what I mean? Like in the Naruto manga, you had, Jiraiya's fight against Pain. You had, what was it? You had Kakashi, Guy, and Naruto against Obito. And just these fights where one of the things that always, intrigued me about them is seeing the good guys going up against the bad guys. And then through fighting them, they figure out their abilities. And then as the fight goes on, they come up with plans in order to counter their abilities. But now with Koji, it feels like that's been completely removed from the equation. You know what I mean? And, now you have Koji basically telling him, listen, I'm about to give you the cheat codes, essentially. I'm about to give you the answers. And this could be a way for the story to essentially subvert our expectations, because by telling us right now that Koji is going to give them this information, maybe there is a chance that something is going to happen that they don't expect. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into it and nothing really is going to happen. But this is where we cut to the ending of the chapter, or the last part of the chapter. And this is where we see what I guarantee you most people are going to be talking about when it comes to this chapter. So we cut to the lodge, the room where Sarada, Ada, and Daemon are. And Ada is just flat out asking Sarada and Sumire, when are you going to confess your feelings to Boruto? And Sarada responds with, what do you mean when? And she asks him about how, well, I mean, you told Sumire about your feelings, so why not just do the same for Boruto? And this is where they both essentially reveal to her that they can't really do that now because Boruto essentially has a lot on his plate right now. And doing something like telling him how they feel about him is not really going to help him. In fact, it's probably going to essentially make him distracted, and he basically can't focus on what he needs to do because of that. So they're basically going to hold off on it right now. And Sumire actually does bring up something important, because this is something that does need to be considered, which is that, they need to also think about Boruto's feelings. It's they can't just think about their own feelings. They need to think about him as well. And this is where we see them make a big, big mistake. They got so caught up in their emotions that they forgot to think with their heads, because if they had, they would have realized that, oh, wait a minute, talking about love and how much we care about someone else, all our feelings about someone else with Ada, while she's right there, probably not the smartest idea, because them doing this essentially confirmed to Ada what she suspected about them all this time. Because Ada just flat out asks them again. She did ask them in chapter 1, but now she's asking them again whether or not they actually are affected by omnipotence. And we immediately see 2 panels of Sarada and Sumire where it clicks in their head that, oh shit, we fucked up. And then immediately we see a panel of Sarada looking over to Daemon, and then essentially remembering what Shikamaru warned them about, that if Daemon finds out that they're not affected by omnipotence, that means they are potentially capable of killing his sister, and he's not going to allow that. And this is where we cut back to Ada, and she points out how essentially it shouldn't be possible for them to talk about how much they like someone else, even though they're right in front of her. Now, if she wasn't there, then it would make sense, because since they're far away from her, she doesn't really have any effect on them. But since she's right there, really close to them, that shouldn't be possible. And Ada knows that that's how her abilities work, because she's seen it happen. And this is where we see Sarada and Sumire looking together, and they basically realize they fucked up. And we see Daemon move just a little bit, and Sarada, so spooked by it, she immediately cuts on her Mangekyo. But here is where we see an insane speed feat from Daemon. So even with her Mangekyo, Daemon in an instant is right there behind them. And it isn't until he is basically right there behind them and he lands on the couch that they're sitting on, that's when Sarada immediately knows that he's behind them, but it's way too late because he immediately grabs them. So that means that his ability is on and there's essentially nothing any of them could do. Sarada could activate her power, which, yes, was strong enough to destroy Ryu, but it doesn't matter because it's just going to get reflected right back at her, and she's basically going to kill herself. And we see them both sweating because they both know what's going on. And remember, they can't even think about hurting him because even that will get reflected back at them. And this is where we see an interesting statement from Daemon. It's interesting, but it's also true because he points out how he knows that Sarada just tried to do something with her Mangekyo. And he even in a way taunts her by talking about how she has her venerable Mangekyo Sharingan. And he talks about how, well, it doesn't really matter what you have. If you get killed before you have the ability to use it, then none of it matters. And the last panel we see is this kind of scary close-up of Daemon where he's grabbing, and we see him grabbing them by the neck. And it is pretty terrifying when you think about it. And we see Ada just looking at all this happen. She's not sweating or anything. Now, obviously, I don't think Daemon's going to kill Sarada. I would be really surprised if they actually went that route. I'm not going to lie. And I don't think any of them are going to die. I don't think either Sarada or Sumire are going to die here. And I think that what's likely to happen is Ada is going to tell Daemon to not do it. Now, whether or not Daemon will listen to her, I don't know. And maybe in the next chapter, we'll see why Ada was essentially awakening Daemon from the pod that he was in. So that's basically where the chapter ends. Now, overall, it was an okay chapter. We got a lot of interesting dialogue, and I didn't think that there were necessarily any wasted pages because remember in the last chapter, I thought there were some pages that were wasted where we just, got told information that we already knew, even though it did make sense in the chapter because it was being told to someone who didn't know. But for me personally, I didn't really like it because it just felt like they were kind of wasting pages on something that could have been taken care of in like one panel. And there was none of that here. And I thought the pace was, pretty well done from beginning to end. And I'm obviously now curious to immediately jump into the next chapter and see how exactly this is going to get resolved. Again, I don't think Sarada or Sumire are going to die, but I'm just really curious to see what happens from here. So with that being said and out of the way, guys, thank you so much for, joining me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll join me for my review of Boruto 2 Blue Vortex Chapter 27. Bye for now.